We are now moving to another amazing group of leaders and a very critical topic. And I want to welcome this outstanding group of experts who are presenting on the panel called Climate Finance for Climate Justice. And you've been hearing many of the speakers so far today at some point talk about the economy and about finance, because this is so critical to how we're going to actually move the dial on our solutions. It's not the only factor, but it's really an essential one, and we have to face it straight on. So thank you to all the critical work that these leaders are doing. Climate finance is a component of achieving climate justice that we can't leave out. Global South countries often bear the brunt of climate-related disasters, as you've been hearing about, despite having contributed least to the global greenhouse gas emissions. Climate finance needs to address the transfer of funds from wealthier industrial nations who are the main polluters to support clean energy initiatives, disaster resilience, and advancement in more impacted regions. So this transfer of funds is a lot of what has been fought over at the COP and is going on as a conversation between countries ongoingly. But climate finance is not just about projects, it's also about addressing historical inequities and ensuring a fair distribution of climate burdens and benefits. And as we've seen, climate finance reflects deep global inequalities, making it one of the biggest fights in the climate justice movement. For climate finance to serve climate justice, it must be accessible, transparent, and aligned with the needs and priorities of frontline communities. And this includes prioritizing grants over loans. And this is a big topic, and it certainly was addressed very heavily at COP29 in Azerbaijan, where we're talking about the quality of the funds, because we don't want to create further burdens through debt to the global south. So we need to recognize the sovereignty of local decision-making and ensure that Indigenous people and marginalized groups have a voice in funding decisions and that we move it to quality grants. I'm also so glad to introduce these esteemed panelists who can deepen our understanding of climate finance. And, again, this could be, an entire workshop for 3 days. So we'll get a taste from each of them, which I'm very thankful for. And we are also sharing in the chat a recent WECAN report on climate finance that centers a climate justice framework. Again, so in your own time, you can take time to sort of digest this conversation at other levels. So we'll be sharing that report as well. So in the order that we're going to be hearing from the speakers, first we'll be hearing from Meena Raman, Head of Programs from the Third World Network from Malaysia. Then we'll be hearing from Bronwen Tucker from the Global Public Finance Campaign. She is a co-manager of Oil Change International in Canada. Then we'll be hearing from Klelia, Guerrero, García, Tax and Gender Justice Specialist from the Latin American and for the Caribbean Network for Social, Economic, and Environmental Justice. And she is from the organization Latindadd from Ecuador. And then we'll be hearing from Gloria Majiga, who is a policy officer from Natural Resources and Sustainable Climate Finance Justice Network in Africa. And she is from Malawi. And I'm so honored to have all these experts here, and I can't wait to learn from all of you. And first, we'll be hearing from Meena. Please go ahead. You have the floor.
Thank you so much to WECAN for organizing this and having me on the panel. I am sorry that I'm not able to be there in person, but I hope this recording will actually lend voice to all the efforts that you all are putting. I just wanted to start with the COP in Baku, Azerbaijan, which, as many of you know, was billed as a finance COP, which was actually a big letdown with a very weak finance outcome. And some people called it a joke, some called it an insult. In fact, some developing countries said that. And particularly because they did not meet the needs of the developing countries, the final outcome. Others called it an optical illusion. So this was really something that was most disappointing. Now, given the current geopolitical turbulence and with the US exit, we can't really expect much from the official process. But we must do all we can to continue to demand climate finance for climate justice. Developed countries have argued that the new finance goal is premised on a mobilization only target, which is what for those of you who look at the Paris Agreement, it's what's embodied in Article 9.3 of the Paris Agreement, which is about developed countries taking the lead in the global effort to mobilize climate finance. Now, what's significant here is that they did not want to deal with the mandatory requirement to provide climate finance under Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement, which states very clearly that developed countries shall provide finance to developing countries for their mitigation and adaptation actions. Now, for those of us who follow the decisions, and these are international treaties, it's a shall obligation and it's mandatory. So we have to keep reminding the developed countries that this is a mandatory obligation which must be met and has to be complied with. And we are 10 years into the Paris Agreement, 2015, when Paris Agreement was signed. And yet there is this non-compliance of Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement. So this is critical for recognizing. And why did it come about? Why is there an obligation? And climate justice, from a climate justice lens, it's very clear that this was due to the recognition of the historical responsibility of developed countries for their historical emissions since the industrial era. Now, it is not charity, it is not overseas development assistance or development aid, but is based on the principle of equity and common but differentiated responsibility. And this is the recognition of climate debt, which is a foundation of climate justice, is the climate debt owed by the developed world for their overuse of the carbon budget to limit temperature rise. I think this is a very important notion, because this is about the recognition that developed countries have a greater responsibility due to history, particularly because of the overuse or the pumping of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which was unfettered. And that's how they grew rich, not because the developing world is stupid or incapable, but rather because of the history of colonization and all the systemic inequality that has given rise from the colonial era to post-colonialism. So we do need to acknowledge that this is the foundation of climate justice, and this is so important. Now, climate finance refers to grants and concessional loans. It is not about loans of a commercial kind that has to be repaid. That is really contrary to the climate finance definition. Until today, we don't have a climate finance definition, despite the efforts of developing countries, because the developed world says we can have climate finance defined in our own way, in whatever way we want. So this is really the problem. Now, it is clearly not a case of no money or a lack of money, but it's a case of lack of political will, as we all know, on the part of the developed world. Now, if there is a will, certainly there is a way. And the will not materialize on its own, as we all know, but it needs the pressure from social movements and civil society organizations. And of course, in the context of the mobilization of the funds, there have been many proposals forwarded from many quarters, including expert groups, civil society organizations, both inside and outside the climate space in the UNFCCC. It is in the United Nations through the International Financial Institutions Reform, in the Financing for Development, the Convention on Tax Justice. So a lot of efforts, and right now there is a finance for development happening critically towards the UN process, but the political will is really lacking. So some of the sources of finance, for instance, a lot of calls for removal of fossil fuel subsidies given to corporations, for levies on fossil fuel corporations for extraction, and also on windfall profits, for wealth tax on billionaires, a global minimum tax on billionaires equal to only 2% of their wealth would generate an estimated 200 to 250 billion per year. Now, this is actually quite significant. And if you add all the others, you can actually mobilize quite a bit. Then, of course, the financial transaction taxes, which many of us campaigned for, to curb speculative and excessive financial trading. And then there are also many calls for aviation and maritime levies because of the use of fossil fuels. and tax on luxury consumption and so on. So there are many ideas. It's not for a lack of proposals or ways of doing. Also, of course, there is a recognition that there needs to be reforms in the international financial institutions, including in addressing the debt crisis, from debt relief to sovereign debt restructuring mechanisms. They are not new calls, they are all old calls from before. Reforms related to the credit rating agencies, very, very critical, because in a climate context, when developing countries, for instance, I always give the case of Colombia, when the Minister of Environment of Colombia in Sharm el-Sheikh, it was actually in Dubai, when she actually said that when her president announced that Colombia is moving away from fossil fuels, immediately what happened was that the peso, their currency, actually was targeted, and the currency fell, it depreciated. And also, this was because of the credit rating agencies who then rated Colombia very badly. They downgraded Colombia's rating, which actually led to Colombia having to borrow a lot more in a commercial in the commercial market, which it cannot afford. So you see how the credit rating agencies, instead of actually enabling a country which wants to do the right thing, the policy coherence goes in the long way. There's no policy coherence. In other words, the international financial architecture is not suited for the kind of demands that we are asking for. So we can't just concentrate in the UNFCCC. We have to fight on all fronts. And this is why we also do need to acknowledge that there is the need for systemic reforms, and there is no shortage of these proposals. So we must keep pushing. And it's you are called WECAN. I mean, I don't mean to sound cheesy, but it's about we can do it. I'm sure you had a history for that name. And we must do much, much more. And mobilization is at the core. At a time when the world is currently assaulted by unilateral measures that the Trump administration is doing, everybody is so obsessed with what's going on and running to the US to negotiate and being bullied. I think it is time for the civil society and social movements to actually call out on our governments not to be, subservient to the bullies. We have to stand up, we have to fight, and we have to keep doing what we do best. And that means we have to call for climate justice, for climate finance. So I am sure that, many of us will keep fighting, because nothing happens without a struggle. And all of you know that we have to keep at it, keep pushing at it. And I really hope that sanity will prevail at some point in time. But without any mobilization, particularly in the North, from our friends who will have shown so much of solidarity, we are not really going to have much change in the world. And I certainly hope that this is the time for all of us to come together and fight for justice across all the spaces, including for climate justice. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Meena. And I'm glad that it turns out that Meena needed to join us through a pre-record. I'm really glad that she was able to do so. And apologies for my interruption. I had a technical error on my part. So apologies for that interruption during her presentation. I'm glad now that we can bring Bronwen Tucker into the conversation. Bronwen, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, and good afternoon or good morning or whatever time of day it is for you. I'm just really happy to be here, and also to follow Meena for setting such a good stage for what I'll talk about today. I have some brief slides. I think I'll focus today on a just energy transition, but really with a really heavy caveat there that a just transition away from fossil fuels into 100% renewable energy systems can't happen without wider system change and without debt reforms and other changes that Meena was talking about, and also knowing there's things like industrial agriculture or forestry that also will need the same changes. But I'll dive a little bit into fossil fuels and building out that renewable energy system today. And part of that is a report that we released today. And so this is my first time talking about it, and hopefully it's all clear. But basically, this is, yeah, the report's called Private Fantasies and Public Realities, and we are basically looking at, we know that there is so much harm from really relying on private finance and capitalism overall. But we wanted to look even at how much there is an energy transition happening in this approach that's so reliant on private finance being what drives the transition, and basically have found it, we really, it's not just that a just energy transition can't happen without system change, but I think really arguably that an energy transition can't happen at all without more system change. And so, yeah, I'll take us through just a few key findings and hopefully not too many graphs. And I should say, I co-lead the public finance team at Oil Change International. And so we see our role as doing some of this research, and then also really kind of trying to connect fossil fuel focused groups, particularly in the global north, to economic justice, and really showing how these fights are really interconnected. And yeah, I myself got involved in this work through student and migrant justice organizing, both in Edmonton near the tar sands and in Montreal in Canada. So yeah, this was going to this slide. This is just an excerpt from a piece in the Financial Times today where we managed to get this report in mostly unscathed. And basically, this is one of the key findings of showing that, especially in the global south, the kind of approach of really just saying, governments can't do anything, communities can't do anything, we need private finance to finance things, is really not delivering. And so there's been a big surge in finance for some parts of the energy transition in the last few years, and that's really overwhelmingly gone to the global north, as well as China, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but basically where they've had a slightly different approach than what's been happening in countries like Canada. And yeah, just overall, there's not enough money flowing yet. But if I go to the next slide. So this is just showing kind of that surge I talked about, where in the last few years, and this is really largely driven by when we had COVID, governments in the global north really started to put a bunch of public money into a just recovery, and we can see probably in practice an unjust recovery, but we can see that kind of surge of public money then kind of attracting some private finance as well. So this is global finance flows for energy transition related investments, whether or not we agree with them, but you can see really that surge is almost entirely limited to the global north and China. And so I can go to the next slide. And then this is definitely an imperfect picture of what we might need in terms of money for a just energy transition. But basically what we've done is looked at the major models and tried to fix them as much as we can with existing research. There's definitely some gaps, but so kind of we've looked at the regions and seeing that, under this private finance led approach, we are mostly only seeing money to the global north and China. There's certainly exceptions within that, but you saw that beautiful flat line in the last slide. This is kind of looking at the sectors or areas that we might need instead of, or that we would need money invested in, and deeply imperfect. Like I can give an example of some adjustments that we've made. The second bar here is for electric vehicles, and we've cut that in half, or almost more than half, to add the public transit and rail column, which public transit and rail was absent from almost every energy model. And so I think probably I'm hearing about lots about transition minerals and the risks of over extraction today. I'm sure this bar and this amount of investment in electric vehicles is probably more than we might say is actually aligned with a just energy transition. But in terms of looking across numbers that we could find that had done some global modeling, this was kind of the best we could do. There was one global study on public transit, which is just incredibly depressing, and that was already 6 years old. Similarly, for fair fossil fuel phase out for workers and communities, that other striped bar, we can see there was there's no tracking available. And again, there was only one estimate available. So I think basically the core argument that we've made in this paper is I think that private finance really, I think there's just so much literature that's really important talking about the impacts of debt and inequality and human rights violations from really relying on the private sector. But what we wanted to add was just showing that it's not even delivering anything close to an energy transition, and all of these communities and all of these key sectors are really being left behind. And so, yeah, I can definitely share the link to the paper in the slides. There's a few other pieces that I'll just mention really briefly, but we looked at some of the sources that you could use of public funding instead to fund real just energy transition priorities. And there's also just some key global days of action coming up on June 27th to 29th. And so I can share a toolkit for how to get involved in those as well. But yeah, thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Bronwen, for that incredible presentation and work. And I know for some people who might not be directly involved in climate finance, it's a lot to take in. But when I first started doing this work, oh my gosh, in 2009, I never thought I would need to learn about the economic structures and understand financing in the way that this climate justice movement has demanded from me. And I was very resistant at first, but actually it's really important for us to all have a lot of knowledge about the movement of these finances, where they're coming from, where we need to organize to improve them, and to understand the basics of how these transitions are happening or not, and how money is directly connected to who's in power, and how that is connected to our resistance and resilience for the years to come. So I really appreciate these detailed analyses, because it's really important that we make ourselves responsible, if you will, for understanding the financial aspect of this, because so much depends on it. And with that, I'd like to hand the floor to Klelia. Please join us. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Osprey, and thank you to WECAN for the invitation. It is a true honor to be part of this collective space, a space that centers women in all their diversity, not only as witnesses to climate breakdown, but also as leaders of systemic transformation. I speak to you today from Ecuador, one of the most diverse, biodiverse countries in the world, but it is also one of the most exposed to environmental, economic, and social vulnerabilities. Like many in Latin America, we face the convergence of multiple crises, ecological collapse, extractive dependency, rising debt, and inequality. These crises do not affect everyone in the same way. They are filtered through race, class, gender, territory, and mainly power. And yet, even in this harsh context, women are not only resisting, we are proposing. We are building food sovereignty in rural communities, defending forests from illegal mining, and reimagining what economic justice can look like. That's the vision we uphold at Latindadd. This is the Latin American Network for Economic and Social Justice. We're a platform of civil society organizations working together to propose bold alternatives to the current financial and fiscal systems, because we believe that fiscal systems and climate finance must not perpetuate injustice, they must repair it. Unfortunately, the current model is failing. Most climate finance today, as it has been already said, flows through the wrong channels. It arrives late, comes as debt, and is often conditioned by interests that serve private investors, not communities. It privileges mitigation over adaptation and is inaccessible to the people most affected. It's also often blind to gendered realities, reinforcing power structures that have historically excluded women, indigenous peoples, and Afro-descendant communities. That is why Latindadd is working across multiple fronts to change both the narrative and the architecture behind this climate finance scene. Let me briefly share some of our current initiatives. First, fiscal justice for climate justice. It is a narrative. The alleged lack of resources for climate action is a myth. Estimates say that globally, if governments were to implement progressive wealth taxes or eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and curb tax abuse, we could mobilize over $2 trillion US dollars annually. And this is not a technical problem, it is a political choice. So we advocate for progressive, permanent tax reforms that prioritize climate action and redistribute wealth, while ensuring as well that the Global South is not forced to finance the climate crisis through more debt. The second point would be that debt justice is also climate justice, because Latindadd has been leading some voice in analyze the so-called debt for nature swaps, for instance. We recently published a critical assessment of Ecuador's marine bond in the Galapagos Island, highlighting concerns about sovereignty, participation, and transparency around this process. In the same line, we're also calling for the UN binding framework sovereign debt that puts people and ecosystems first. And we, in that line, support the cancellation of illegitimate debts, especially those incurred through fossil fuel-based extractivist development. The third point is that feminist fiscal proposals in Latin America have filters. As I said before, women in Latin America are disproportionately affected by climate change, yet we are underrepresented in public finance decision-making, and that is not fair. And that is why we are also developing intersectional equity assessments for tax policies, advocating for gender-responsive budgets and auditing regressive tax expenditures that subsidize polluters and the elites. We promote public finance that funds care systems, rural resilience, community-driven adaptation, because we know that economic justice and climate justice are deeply intertwined and deeply gendered. Fourth, we invite you to reimagine the global financial governance. Latindadd is part of the Global Civil Society campaign for a UN tax convention, for the reform of the IMF's special drawing rights, and for a climate finance architecture that is transparent, inclusive, and just. We believe that decisions about global finance must no longer be made in clubs of the powerful, but in a space where all voices count, especially those from the Global South. All of this work is grounded in a shared conviction. Climate finance must stop being a tool of extraction and start being a vehicle for repair, redistribution, and regeneration. It must be shaped by those who are most affected by it, not by technocrats or investors. And it must be built on principles of intergenerational, gender, and ecological justice. As we move toward COP30 and beyond, let us remember that it is not just a climate crisis. It is a crisis of governance, of inequality, and even of imagination. And our response must be just as multidimensional. Spaces like these show us that this is possible to make. And that is the invitation that I leave you with, that a feminist, decolonial, justice-centered transition is not only necessary, but it is already underway. Let's continue to build power together to make climate finance truly serve people and the planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Klelia, for that excellent presentation and for the hard work that you're doing. It's so important. Your organization and all the work that you're presenting to the world is so very important, and how you broke everything down. I really appreciate it. And also to help us with a systemic approach to how we're going to address climate finance. And I'd like to bring in our final speaker on this panel, Gloria Majiga. You have the floor. Thank you, Gloria.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here. Very sad to be the last speaker because it feels like my role is just to reiterate a lot of what has been said already, because I think it's been such a good and a heavy conversation. But I thought I would start maybe just sharing from a personal perspective why I think that the feminist perspective in this conversation is so important. I recall, I think a couple of years back at the New York Climate Week, one one presenter, I think it was Casey, she made a presentation, and I recall after her presentation, just meeting her, and we didn't speak, we didn't say anything, we didn't have to talk about anything. We just sat there, I think, in silence for just a couple of moments, just sharing so much emotion and just the understanding of us coming from very different parts of the world, but having such similar experiences in witnessing inequalities and seeing women bearing the brunt of the afflictions from climate change, from all the things that happen around us, and how we carry that burden of preserving nature. And I think that the aspect of climate finance, for me personally, was not something that I would have linked to the work that we think about around this, but it's so important because we have to have a means of achieving the change that we want to bring about. And so I'll be sharing a little bit on the work that we as Tax Justice Network are doing around climate finance and extractives and tax. So I'm not a numbers person, but I just thought I should share some really interesting numbers that have come up from some of the research that we've done. We did some research with Action Aid on what it would look like for countries to phase out fossil fuels and what the cost of implementing the different climate action plans would be on these countries. And we found that in Liberia, for example, extractives contribute about 56% of the GDP, but only 16% of that actually goes to domestic revenues. And they have a $395 million gap in climate finance. This is from their NDCs. So what they need to actually respond to climate change is so huge that there is no way they can recoup it even from domestic resources. We also found that in countries like Nigeria, for example, where they have huge losses of revenues from extractives, and this is due to transparency gaps, corruption, and other issues. But they need 29.7 billion every year to respond to climate change impacts. But so far, they've only been able to raise 2.5 billion, and this is since they launched their climate policy and their energy transition plan. And a huge part of those losses also go to subsidies, which cost around 9.3 billion. And in Zimbabwe, we found that they have a 98% funding gap just for climate response. So I feel like when you think about these numbers in the grand scheme of things, they're just so immense. I think we've been talking about 100 billion, but sometimes it feels like, oh, it's a figure. But if you look at the needs that are there and what it means for these countries, for the people that are being affected, you really start to see that in the grand scheme of things, we're not asking for a lot, but we need so much more than even what we're agreeing to. And that's why the conversation of climate finance is so important, not just in regards to mitigation, but also to adaptation. And so what is not working, the things that are really hurting us, I think, especially in the global south, first, I think Meena talked a little bit about the debt mechanism. So these are things that have created debt cycles. So now we have countries that are increasingly in austerity and are unable to contribute to social needs or healthcare needs or education needs in their countries, let alone climate response. So already many countries are in distress because of debt, and then you bring in the need to respond to climate issues, it becomes almost like you're asking for the impossible. And yet this is something that is causing even bigger impacts, because even the social services are being affected because of the floods, because of the different natural disasters that are happening. You've got a higher cost on even those social services. So now countries are continuously in distress. And then again, it's not charity. It is literally just compensation or reparations, as you would want to call it, because someone else caused a problem. And all we're saying is that there needs to be a mechanism for you to contribute to addressing this problem. So I think that this comes down to perception. The perception that we have in having this conversation about climate finance is really important. We need to move away from going in with the understanding that, oh, we want to come to an agreement. And I really appreciate, I think, a lot of the work that many CSOs and activists have done to really stand up, even at COP, to protest and to get into the spaces and say that we demand a response and to hold countries accountable that should be honoring those commitments. And that perception, I think, for me is really important because that frames how we get into that conversation. And so we need to really look at it as we want grants, we don't want loans. We want to see debt cancellation. These are things that are non-negotiables. It's no longer an issue of, oh, it's part of this process. This is very clear and straightforward. It's been clearly highlighted in the UNFCCC, and that's something that we should not be negotiating anymore. And that comes from a place of perception. And then transitions. In our research, we've also found that a lot of countries are very uneasy about a transition and phasing out fossil fuels. This again ties back to the issue of debt. So a lot of countries that are involved in fossil fuel extraction attach some of these PSAs to different dates that they're able to incur because they look at projected revenues in the future. And what this means is that if we call for a phase out, it means that these countries will be further in distress. They're unable to pay their debts. So this comes back to the call for debt cancellation. If we're going to have a just transition, debt cancellation needs to be at the top of that list because that is the only way that it can be just. And that can allow countries that are dependent on fossil fuels to also have a chance at actually transitioning to renewable energy. And so I think that in general, if we look at what needs to be done right now, learning from the Mozambique debt crisis, I think we can see that a just transition really requires us to bring together countries and allow them to have that opportunity to transition fairly. There's a lot of tools right now, a lot of processes that are there. And one thing that I think we can leave with from this meeting is the idea of entering spaces that are uncharted to us. We need to get into conversations that are not just central to climate, but also are related to other issues. For example, we now have the UN Tax Convention. These may not be spaces that conventionally what we would consider climate conversations, but they're important because when we get to COP, it's like some decisions have already been made, some processes have already overtaken whatever would be said at COP. So it's important for us to be able to be part of those processes. And by the time we get to COP, we're also aware that these things are interlinked and that we've been able to influence certain decisions to mobilize the resources that we need. The just part is really, really important. The how is important. So in discussing transitions, we really need to have a clear conversation on the how it's going to be done so that we do not further inequalities. My time is up, but thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gloria, for that really powerful presentation and clearly spelling out what it means to have economic justice and how we need to move away from this understanding that somehow these funds that are being transferred are to be done in the form of loans instead of direct grants, as you said. And it is a form of reparations and responsibility for the wealthy countries that have caused the most pollution and harm. So I just wanted to highlight that this is also very essential that we have an understanding of the fairness of this equity, that it's not a false demand, that it's a real demand, and it's been going on for many, many, many years. So thank you for pointing that out to us. And one of the things that I'll just say in closing for this panel, and I really want to thank all the presenters for your incredible details and a way to be able to articulate these complex topics is really important. And we have put all your information in the chat for people to learn more. But certainly when we were at COP29 in Azerbaijan, it was such a difficult COP, probably one of the most difficult and challenging negotiations I've ever been to, because it was about climate finance and this huge struggle for the global south to really make clear that countries in the global north, the wealthy countries, to put it more simply, have got to pay their fair share. And it's just a huge challenge to get that narrative clear, to get those negotiations clear, and to make those demands over and over again. And in fact, Even now, with the climate talks happening in Bonn, the intersessional, there's been a lot of stalling because people still have not resolved what happened in Azerbaijan. So it's hard to go forward until we really resolve this issue around climate finance. And it's going to go on, and it will be something that will continue on into Brazil. So thank you so much for the incredible work that you're all doing and how vital it is. And to pull it also away from, we need to speak in numbers because it keeps us all very real about what we're talking about, but to always remember, as many of the speakers did, like we're talking about human life and what these funds mean to people living, what it means to being able to adapt to the climate crises that are already happening and those to come. It's life that we're talking about, energy, resources equaling who gets to live. So it's a very critical conversation. Thank you all so much for being with us and for your powerful work. We really appreciate it, and we hope people will follow up with you. Thank you.